The first sound was laughter, cruel, bright, and slicing through the velvet hum of the London ballroom. It came from behind a fan of white feathers, carried on perfume and malice. "Poor Lady Clara," someone whispered. "So plain, so timid. Even her dowry seems to blush at being seen." The laughter rippled wider this time, polite but poisonous, and in its wake stood Lady Clara Whitmore, 20 years of age, the only daughter of a once great family now unraveling thread by thread. She had come hoping for admiration, perhaps even kindness, but the season offered neither. The chandeliers burned above her like watchful eyes, and the weight of every glance pressed against her chest. She tried to smile, an effort so delicate it could have been mistaken for pain. Her gown, pale ivory trimmed with fading lace, had belonged to her late mother. It hung slightly loose at the shoulders, as though even fabric recoiled from being associated with misfortune. Her father had insisted she attend. "A single good marriage, Clara," he'd said, "and you could save us all." So she stood there, the family's last hope, trembling behind a crystal glass of watered champagne while the orchestra played waltzes meant for others. At the edge of the crowd, the Duke of Ashbourne entered. Conversations dimmed like candles touched by wind. He was a figure carved from austerity, tall, impeccably dressed, with eyes the color of cold iron and a reputation that silenced any who might dare gossip within his hearing. At 48, he had lived 2 lives already, one as a husband betrayed, another as a widower who chose solitude over scandal. They called him the Cold Duke. It was said that his heart, once broken, had turned to stone. Clara did not notice him at first. She was too busy steadying her breath, praying no one else would speak her name. Near the refreshment table, 2 women passed close enough for their voices to sting. Her father gambled away the estate, one murmured. "She'll have to marry an old man or a desperate one." The other laughed softly. "Or both. Though I doubt even pity would compel a gentleman to kiss such a dull little thing." Those words landed like a slap. Clara turned slightly, pretending to study the flowers arranged in a gilded urn, but her vision swam. She thought of her mother, gone these 5 years, who had always said, "Kindness is your strength, Clara. But the world seldom rewards the gentle." Perhaps her mother had been right. Her father, watching from the opposite side of the room, avoided her gaze. She understood why. Shame was contagious. And then, a presence. She felt it before she saw him, a stillness parting the air. When she turned, the Duke stood mere paces away, his gaze unreadable. The orchestra faltered for the briefest instant as if uncertain whether to play in his shadow. Around them, voices dropped to whispers. Their eyes met, and for one suspended heartbeat, she forgot to be afraid. His face bore no expression, yet something in his posture, a weariness that did not belong to age but to memory, unraveled her composure. She curtsied too quickly, nearly spilling her glass. "Your Grace," she stammered. He inclined his head. "Lady Whitmore." His tone was courteous but distant, like winter sunlight, beautiful, untouchable. "I fear we've not been introduced," she murmured. "I fear you are correct." A pause, and then his eyes drifted briefly to the circle of onlookers pretending not to watch them. "Nor do I think such formalities much matter to them." She followed his gaze. Across the room, the same pair of women from earlier were whispering again, their fans fluttering like restless wings. Heat rose to Clara's cheeks. "They find amusement in misfortune," she said quietly, then wished she hadn't. One did not confess vulnerability to a man like him. But the Duke's expression shifted, barely, but unmistakably. "Cruelty often disguises itself as conversation," he said, his voice lower now. "You must not let it wound you." "I try not to," she replied, "though it seems to find me rather often." He studied her, not with pity but with a kind of reluctant curiosity. "You are not what they say," he said finally, almost to himself. Clara blinked. "And what do they say, Your Grace?" "That you are timid. That you are unremarkable." His eyes softened fractionally. "They are wrong on both counts." Before she could reply, he turned away, his departure as abrupt as his arrival. The murmurs began at once, speculation, envy, disbelief. Clara stood frozen, uncertain whether to feel grateful or more exposed than before. Later, in the carriage home, her father was nearly jubilant. "The Duke of Ashbourne noticed you," he said, his voice trembling with hope. "He spoke to you before all of London society. Perhaps he might even consider—" He stopped himself, unwilling to voice such an impossible dream. But in that silence, the hope took root. Clara stared out the window, watching rain streak against the glass. The city blurred into light and shadow. She could still hear the Duke's voice, "You are not what they say." It was a simple sentence, yet it had lodged somewhere deep within her, warming a place she hadn't realized was cold. Days passed. Letters arrived bearing condolences rather than invitations, her family's debts deepened. Her father grew desperate enough to visit the Duke's solicitor, under pretense of seeking advice. Clara did not know until it was done. When the carriage came for her the following afternoon, her father's hands trembled as he adjusted her bonnet. "He has asked for your hand," he whispered, almost reverent. She felt the world tilt. "The Duke?" He nodded, unable to meet her eyes. "It is an honor beyond measure, Clara. Do not question it. This marriage will restore everything we've lost." "But he barely knows me," she said softly. "Why would he?" "Do not ask." His voice cracked. "Simply be grateful." The carriage door closed before she could speak again. The streets rolled past, gray and endless, until they reached the Duke's townhouse, silent, imposing, its windows reflecting the dull sky like mirrors that refused to reveal anything. Servants ushered her inside without ceremony. In the drawing room, the Duke awaited. He stood by the fire, one hand resting on the mantel, his profile cut sharp against the glow. For a moment, neither spoke. Then he turned toward her. "I trust your father has informed you of my proposal," he said. "He has, Your Grace," she replied, her voice steady though her heart thundered. "But I do not understand it." His gaze held hers, calm but searching. "You will," he said simply. "In time." She swallowed. "And if I am not, what you expect?" "Expectation," he said, "is the enemy of peace. I seek neither beauty nor brilliance, Lady Clara, only quiet." The fire snapped, sending sparks up the chimney. She thought of the ballroom laughter, of the whispers that had followed her like shadows. A quiet life, even beside a stranger, might be better than ridicule. "Then I accept," she said, almost in a whisper. Something unreadable flickered in his eyes, surprise, perhaps, or sorrow. "So be it," he murmured. "The wedding shall be held within the week." When she curtsied and turned to leave, she heard him speak again, so softly she almost believed she had imagined it. "Do not fear me, Clara." Outside, the carriage waited in the mist, and the bells of St. James tolled faintly in the distance. She climbed inside, hands trembling, the echo of his words following her into the fog, words that felt less like comfort and more like a warning. The carriage wheels shrieked against the cobblestones as rain began to fall, a sharp, relentless sound that seemed to echo the tremor in Clara's chest. She sat rigid beside the Duke, her gloved hands clasped so tightly that her knuckles blanched beneath the lace. They had been wed not an hour ago in a ceremony so brief and silent it scarcely felt real. No music, no laughter, no tender congratulations. Only vows exchanged under the cold arch of St. James Church, witnessed by two indifferent clerks and a priest who mispronounced her name. The Duke had not once looked at her as he spoke his promise. His voice had carried neither warmth nor cruelty, merely the efficiency of a man sealing a contract. Now, in the confined hush of the carriage, she could feel his presence like frost at her side. The scent of raindamp wool clung to him, mingling with the faintest trace of tobacco. Every turn of the wheel seemed to drive her farther from the world she had known and deeper into one that belonged entirely to him. When he finally spoke, the sound startled her. "You are comfortable, I trust?" "Yes, Your Grace," she managed. The words sounded brittle, as though they might crack under their own politeness. "Good." His gaze remained on the rain-streaked window. "Ashbourne Manor is some distance from the city. We should arrive by nightfall." She nodded, though he was not looking. The silence that followed stretched taut between them, heavy with unspoken thoughts. Clara glanced once toward him, catching the faint reflection of his face in the glass. The lines of grief there were unmistakable, etched too deeply for mere age to explain. She wondered what kind of love could leave such marks, and whether she was to live forever in its shadow. The rain thickened into a storm. Outside, the moors blurred into darkness. Inside, she gathered her courage and said softly, "It was kind of you, Your Grace, to grant my father's request." At that, his eyes flicked toward her, the briefest spark of surprise. Kindness had little to do with it, Lady Ashbourne. The title struck her like a bell, new, foreign, echoing through her. "Then why?" He studied her a moment longer before turning away. "Because I have grown weary of pitying stares and simpering introductions. Because a house such as mine requires a mistress, and society demands appearances. You seemed suitable." "Suitable," she repeated faintly. He inclined his head, untroubled by her tone. "I trust that does not offend you." "It does not," she lied. The rest of the journey passed in silence, save for the ceaseless rain. When they reached Ashbourne Manor, twilight lay like smoke across the grounds. The servants lined the steps in cautious formation, their faces unreadable. Clara descended first, her shoes sinking into the gravel. The mansion loomed before her, vast, gray, and heavy with history. No candles burned in the windows, even the ivy that clung to the stone seemed reluctant to let go. Inside, the air smelled of polish and old roses. Portraits of unsmiling ancestors watched her as she followed the butler through echoing halls. The Duke's footsteps trailed behind, deliberate and soundless. At the top of the grand staircase, the butler paused before a door. "Her Grace's chamber," he announced. Clara turned to thank him, but he was already bowing away. She stepped inside. The room was lovely in a distant, forgotten sort of way, silk curtains faded by sunlight, a writing desk untouched by years, a mirror draped in linen. On the vanity rested a single object, a small gold locket, delicate and worn at the edges, as though cherished long ago. She lifted it carefully, half expecting it to bear her name. Inside, however, there was nothing, no portrait, no inscription. Just the faint scent of lavender. She smiled despite herself. Perhaps it was a gesture from her new husband, a silent welcome in place of words. That night, she dined alone. A footman informed her that His Grace preferred to take his meals in the study. The roasted pheasant cooled untouched on her plate while the wind pressed against the windows. She had never known loneliness to feel so vast. Unable to sleep, she wrote him a note, graceful and brief, thanking him for the locket, for his hospitality, for everything she could not yet understand. She left it with a servant before retiring, unaware that the locket had once belonged to the Duke's late mother, and that no one had dared move it from that table in over 20 years. Morning brought sunlight that felt almost like trespass. Clara dressed simply and wandered the halls, tracing her fingers along shelves of untouched books and dust-veiled instruments. The manor, though magnificent, bore the stillness of a mausoleum. Even the servants moved as if afraid to disturb its silence. In the garden, she found solace. The earth was wild with neglect, roses tangled in vines, fountains dry as bone. She knelt among the weeds and began to clear them, her gloves soon stained with soil. The gardener approached hesitantly. "Beg pardon, Your Grace, but we've had no lady tending the roses since," he stopped himself. "Since when?" she asked. He lowered his eyes. "Since the late Duchess, ma'am." Clara smiled faintly. "Then let us bring them back to life, shall we?" By afternoon, rumors had already spread among the servants. The new Duchess, it seemed, had dirt beneath her nails and kindness in her voice, a combination both bewildering and endearing. The Duke heard the whispers but said nothing. From his study window, he watched her move through the garden, her skirts brushing against the dying blooms. The sight stirred something uncertain within him, like the memory of music long forgotten. When the butler delivered her note that evening, he hesitated before opening it. Her handwriting was neat, delicate, unpretentious. "Thank you for the locket," it read. "It is beautiful, and I shall treasure it always." He stared at the words for a long time, his brow furrowed. No one had thanked him in years, not for gifts, not for affection, not for anything. He looked toward the mantel where the companion to that locket once hung, long buried with his mother. The idea that this young woman had mistaken it for a token of tenderness unsettled him more than he cared to admit. At dinner, he appeared unexpectedly. Clara rose, startled. He gestured for her to sit. The silence between them felt gentler now, not quite warm but no longer cold. "I received your note," he said after a moment. "I hope I did not presume too much, Your Grace. It was foolish to think." "It was not foolish," he interrupted, though the words came stiffly. "I had forgotten it was there. You may keep it if you wish." She smiled, a genuine light that caught him unprepared. "Then I thank you again." For the first time, he looked at her fully. There was something honest in her gratitude that disarmed him. Around them, the candles flickered, and the long shadows of the room seemed to retreat. But before he could speak again, a servant entered with a folded newspaper. "Your Grace," he said uneasily, "for your attention." The Duke glanced at the headline, and his jaw tightened. Clara watched the color drain from his face. He folded the paper and set it aside, his expression unreadable. "Is something wrong?" she asked. "Only the world," he said quietly. Later, after she retired, he remained alone at the table, staring into the fire. The newspaper lay open beside him. The words were cruel, printed in bold for all to read: "The cold Duke marries the penniless Miss Whitmore, a union of pity and convenience." He closed his eyes briefly, and in that silence, one thought rose like smoke, that the gentlewoman upstairs would soon learn just how merciless society could be. The newspaper's cruel headline spread through London like wildfire, reaching even the distant village near Ashbourne within a week. By then, Clara had already felt the shift in the servants' glances, sympathy wrapped in discomfort. They moved quietly around her, polite but hesitant, as though fearing that even kindness might deepen her humiliation. The Duke said nothing of it. His silence was not unkind, but it was heavy, a silence that fenced her in with all the words he refused to speak. She tried to convince herself that she did not care what the world thought, yet the whispers echoed in her mind when she walked through the halls. The penniless Miss Whitmore. The cold Duke's charity. The taunts she had endured in London had followed her home, transformed into printed ink. Still, she held her head high and buried herself in small labors, restoring the garden, tending to the household accounts, writing letters she never sent. Then came the evening that altered the rhythm of everything. The day had been wet and gray, the kind that soaked the air in melancholy. As dusk fell, a storm gathered over the moors, shaking the windows and sending a restless moan through the chimneys. Clara sat in the music room, attempting to play the pianoforte though her fingers trembled with fatigue. The melody faltered. She sighed, pressing one key again and again until the note blurred into grief. From the doorway, a voice said quietly, "You play with sorrow, not with sound." She turned sharply. The Duke stood there, a book in hand, his expression unreadable. He had never entered this room before. "I did not mean to disturb you, Your Grace," she said, rising. "Sit," he murmured. "I disturbed you." The admission startled her. He crossed the room and set the book upon the piano, a worn volume of poetry. "I thought you might prefer this to the silence." She touched the cover lightly. "You read poetry?" "Once," he said. Before words began to taste like lies. Something in the way he said it, a quiet ache beneath his calm, made her heart tighten. She opened the book. Inside, the margins were filled with tiny, faded notes written in a woman's hand. "Your late wife's?" He nodded once. "She loved verse. I kept it because," he trailed off, then shook his head. "Because I could not forget her cruelty without remembering her grace." The air trembled between them, charged with the weight of shared solitude. Clara wanted to comfort him, but decorum restrained her. Instead, she said softly, "Sometimes memories lose their shape if we let them. They stop being ghosts and become only shadows." He looked at her then, truly looked. "You speak as though you have known loss." "I have," she said. "But I have learned that the heart grows back differently when it heals. Never as it was, but sometimes, stronger." He regarded her in silence. Outside, thunder rolled. For the first time, he smiled, a faint, reluctant curve that felt like sunlight through fog. "You are very unlike what I expected, Lady Ashbourne." "What did you expect?" "Fragility," he said. "Compliance. A woman who would quietly exist in my home and ask nothing of me." "And am I such a disappointment?" she asked, her voice trembling between humor and hurt. He hesitated, then said quietly, "Quite the opposite." The storm grew wilder. The candles flickered, one extinguishing with a hiss. Lightning illuminated the window, and for a heartbeat, his face seemed carved from longing. Then the moment fractured, the thunder followed like an accusation. He took a slow step toward her. "Clara," he began, then stopped himself. "Forgive me. I forget that affection, when unearned, can be mistaken for cruelty." She rose, the book clutched against her chest. "You mistake me, Your Grace. I do not fear affection. Only silence." His expression wavered, something raw flickering behind his restraint. "Then let us not be silent tonight." He gestured for her to sit near the fire, and together they read from the poetry book as the storm raged. His voice, low and precise, carried a gravity that made even simple verses sound profound. When she took her turn, he listened with eyes half closed, as though her words soothed some hidden ache. Time melted around them. When the last candle burned low, the wind struck hard against the panes, and the room dimmed into near darkness. A bolt of lightning split the sky, and the house shuddered. She gasped softly, instinctively reaching for balance. Her fingers brushed his hand. The contact was fleeting, accidental, but it stole her breath. He did not pull away. The silence that followed was deafening. The world outside was chaos, yet here, between them, everything held perfectly still. Her heart pounded. "Forgive me," she whispered. I did not mean." He cut her off gently. "Do not apologize for being alive." She swallowed, unable to look away from him. His eyes, once cold, now glimmered with a strange, restrained warmth. She sensed the conflict in him, the pull between past and present, duty and desire. He stood abruptly, retreating toward the hearth. "You should rest," he said. "It grows late." She rose too, hesitating. "Before I go, may I ask you something?" He nodded. She drew a slow breath, gathering the courage to shatter what remained of propriety. "Your Grace, you once said that words had begun to taste like lies. May I know what truth you fear to speak?" He turned, startled by her boldness. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then, with a voice so low it barely carried, he replied, "That I am not incapable of feeling. Only terrified of it." Her eyes stung. "Then perhaps fear is not the enemy, but the sign that something still lives within you." He looked at her as if seeing her for the first time, not as a duty or a stranger, but as a mirror to his own loneliness. Slowly, deliberately, he stepped closer until only the faintest distance separated them. The air trembled with everything unsaid. "Clara," he murmured, her name no longer formal but fragile, intimate. "You are very young. I would not have you mistake kindness for affection." She lifted her chin, her voice barely above a whisper. "I know the difference." But I would rather be hurt by sincerity than comforted by indifference. He exhaled shakily, his composure unraveling. For a heartbeat, she thought he might close the space between them. But instead, he turned away, gripping the mantel until his knuckles whitened. Then, softly, almost as confession, she said, "I've never been kissed, Your Grace." The words fell into the quiet like glass breaking underwater, gentle yet irrevocable. He froze. The firelight flickered across his face, revealing the storm within. When he spoke, his voice trembled with something fierce and tender. "Then I must earn that right, not claim it." Her heart lurched. The restraint in his tone was more intimate than any touch could have been. She could only whisper, "And if you never seek to earn it?" He looked at her then, eyes shadowed, mouth unsteady. "Then it will be because I fear I already have." The storm outside began to fade, the rain softening to a whisper. Yet inside the manor, another tempest had begun, one of longing and confusion, of wounds reopening in the quiet. He stepped back, bowing his head. "Good night, Clara." She watched him leave, her pulse still echoing in her ears. When the door closed behind him, she pressed her hand to her chest, unsure whether the ache there was sorrow or hope. Upstairs, the Duke paused. At his study window, watching lightning fade across the horizon. For the first time in years, he felt warmth rise against the cold. But beneath it, a tremor of dread, because he knew that once the heart begins to thaw, it cannot choose what it will remember. The letter arrived before dawn, creased, rain-soaked, and marked with the royal seal that made Clara's hands tremble before she even broke it open. She stood in the corridor, bare feet against cold marble, the house still asleep around her. The wax cracked beneath her thumb, and the words unfurled like a blade. "His Grace, the Duke of Ashbourne, is hereby summoned to London to account for matters of inheritance and conduct pertaining to the late Duchess's estate." Beneath it, the name that chilled her, Lord Bertram Whitmore. Her uncle. The man who had once sold her future for his own debts. She didn't wait for the servants to wake. She climbed the east stairs and stopped before the Duke's chamber, heart pounding with both fear and defiance. She knocked once. Silence. Again, louder. At last, the door opened a fraction, and there he was, half-dressed, eyes shadowed from a sleepless night. "Clara?" His voice was husky with surprise. "There's been a summons," she said, thrusting the letter forward. "From London." He took it, frowning as he read. When his gaze lifted again, it was sharp, calculating, but beneath that, something darker flickered. "Your uncle moves faster than I expected." She stared. "You knew?" "I suspected. Men like Bertram do not lose money without seeking revenge. He will try to ruin you, and by extension, me." Her throat tightened. "Then I should go with you." His answer was immediate. "No. You cannot fight him alone. He knows things about my family, about my mother, which he will twist into poison the moment you stand before him." His tone was controlled, but she could hear the strain beneath. "You will remain here. My solicitor will accompany me." "You would face him and the crown alone?" "When the accusation touches me." He turned away, running a hand through his hair. "You do not understand the danger. He has accused me of coercion, of marrying you for your dowry, which, ironically, does not exist. The crown must appear impartial. If you come, they will use you as spectacle." Her heart stung. "And if I stay, they will call me complicit." He looked at her then, eyes weary but burning. "Would you rather the world believe me cruel or believe you corrupted? Choose your wound, Clara." The air between them felt carved from glass. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then she said, quietly but firmly, "I would rather stand beside you and bear truth than hide behind your name and bear shame." Something fractured in his composure, pride, perhaps, or loneliness too long endured. "You are impossible," he murmured, not without tenderness. "Then we are both damned," she said. He closed his eyes briefly, then nodded once. "Very well. But if you come, you obey my word without question." She inclined her head. "I have no wish to be silenced, Your Grace. Only to be heard." By afternoon, they were on the road to London. The storm of the previous night had left the countryside cloaked in mist. Inside the carriage, silence sat between them, not hostile, but tense with unspoken things. She watched the grey fields pass, her thoughts caught between fear and something she dared not name. At last he spoke. "When we reach the capital, you must not let them provoke you. They will speak of my late wife, of the scandal." "I have heard worse," she said softly. "And survived it." He gave a faint smile. "You mistake resilience for armor. It is your heart they aim for, not your reputation." "Then let them aim," she replied. "If truth stands with us, it will not fall." He looked at her for a long while, his expression unreadable. "You make me remember what hope sounds like." The words were simple, but they struck her deeper than any declaration could have. She turned her gaze away, unsure her heart could bear the gentleness in his tone. When they reached London 2 days later, the city was already alive with rumor. The Duke's carriage drew curious eyes wherever it passed, some pitiful, some malicious. At the townhouse, his steward awaited them with grim news: the hearing had been moved up. They were expected that very evening. Clara dressed in silence, her hand steady despite the turmoil within. The gown she chose was simple, dove-gray silk, unadorned save for a thin silver ribbon at the waist. When she descended the stairs, he was waiting, immaculate in dark attire that spoke of power restrained, not flaunted. "You look," he began, then stopped, as if the word itself might betray too much. "Composed." She met his gaze. "Appearances deceive, Your Grace." "They always have," he murmured, offering his arm. The carriage ride to the Royal Council Hall passed in tense quiet. As they entered the chamber, murmurs rippled through the assembled lords. At the far end stood her uncle, Lord Whitmore, his face smug beneath the veneer of civility. He bowed mockingly to the Duke, then to her. "Ah, my dear niece," he drawled. "So the prodigal child returns, with a title bought in pity." Her jaw clenched. The Duke's hand brushed hers briefly, a warning, or perhaps reassurance. He stepped forward. "Say what you came to say, Whitmore." Lord Whitmore smirked. "Only that the marriage between you and my niece was obtained through manipulation. The lady, being destitute and unguarded, could hardly consent freely. I move that her dowry, what little remains, be returned to her rightful kin." Clara's pulse roared in her ears. Before she could speak, the Duke said evenly, "Your claim is false. The lady's inheritance was spent by you. She came to my house with nothing but dignity, something you will never afford her." Laughter rippled through the hall, but Whitmore's sneer did not waver. "Then perhaps her ladyship will speak for herself." All eyes turned to Clara. Her throat felt dry, yet when she spoke, her voice rang clear. "My uncle lies. My marriage was my choice. Whatever fortune he seeks to reclaim is buried with my father's honor, and if justice exists in this room, it will recognize greed when it wears silk." A murmur of approval rose. For the first time, Whitmore's confidence faltered. "But then, with serpent cunning," he said, "and yet, dear niece, it seems odd that a man once accused of infidelity should suddenly wed again. Tell us, Duke, how long did your mourning truly last?" The question struck like a lash. The hall fell silent. The Duke stiffened, every muscle taut. Clara saw the pain flash across his face, raw, unguarded. She stepped closer, defying decorum. "You mock grief because you have never felt it," she said. "His mourning lasted as long as honesty does in your house, forever fleeting." A ripple of shock swept the room. The Duke's eyes met hers, something breaking open between them, gratitude, maybe, or recognition. Then, suddenly, a messenger burst through the doors, breathless. "My lords, news from Ashbourne Manor. There has been an attack." The room erupted in confusion. Clara's breath caught. "Attack?" The messenger bowed low. "Arson, my lady. The West Wing is aflame." The Duke went pale, eyes dark with fury and disbelief. Lord Whitmore only smiled faintly, like a man who had already played his winning card. Clara's knees weakened, her world narrowing to that single, terrible word, aflame. And before anyone could stop him, the Duke whispered, "This was never about money. It was about destroying everything I dared to rebuild." The flames had nearly consumed the West Wing before they arrived, smoke curling like blackened ribbons through the night air, and Clara stood rooted on the gravel, her skirts damp with dew and tears alike. The fire's roar was deafening, a cruel chorus that seemed to mock the fragile triumphs of the day. Yet in that chaos, she saw him, the Duke of Ashbourne, moving with precision and fury, commanding the servants, directing hoses, extinguishers, every ounce of authority sharpened into protective focus. The man reputed to be cold, immovable, now burned with something elemental, the need to safeguard what he loved. Clara's heart pounded as she ran to his side. "Are you hurt?" she cried, voice trembling, choking on the acrid smoke. He turned, eyes flashing beneath so dark lashes, and for a fleeting second she saw the vulnerability he had never allowed the world to witness. "I am unharmed," he said firmly, though his voice carried the strain of adrenaline and fear. "But we cannot save everything. Stay back." She would not. She stepped closer, and he did not stop her. "I am not afraid," she said, steadying her voice as she gripped his arm. "We have faced worse than flames before." His gaze softened for the briefest moment, and she glimpsed the man beneath the legend, the man who had wept for a lost love, who had built walls around his heart only to let her in. He exhaled slowly, the tension in his shoulders relaxing just enough for her to notice how rigidly he had carried himself all these years. Hours passed like eternities as the fire was finally quelled, smoldering ruins hissing and snapping in the cool night air. Clara and the Duke stood side by side, the smoke clinging to their hair and skin, the world reduced to ash and echoes. He glanced at her, his expression unreadable yet touched with gratitude. "You should not have come," he said, his voice low. "And leave you to fight alone?" she countered. "Never." He studied her, as if weighing her courage against her innocence. Then, almost imperceptibly, he smiled, a true, unguarded smile that softened the stern lines of his face. "You are reckless," he murmured, "but brave. I am grateful." In that quiet aftermath, with only the whisper of the wind and the faint crackle of embers, Clara felt a shift. The walls of Ashbourne Manor, once austere and imposing, seemed to exhale. The Duke's presence, previously so commanding yet distant, was now an anchor beside her. She realized that in surviving the storm, both literal and figurative, they had found a fragile equilibrium together. Later, as they walked through the garden, the first hints of dawn painted the sky in soft pinks and golds. The roses Clara had nurtured now seemed to glow with resilience, petals kissed by dew and promise. The Duke moved beside her, slower now, more contemplative. He stopped before a particularly stubborn bush of crimson roses, brushing his hand along the thorns. "You restored these," he said quietly, almost to himself. "They needed care," she replied. "Just as some hearts do." He turned to her then, fully, and for the first time spoke not as a husband bound by duty, but as a man unafraid to reveal the truth of his emotions. "Clara, you have changed everything. Not with wealth or title, but simply by being yourself. By being here, even when the world would rather you cower." Her breath caught. She had never imagined that her presence alone could wield such power. She had expected criticism, whispers, judgment, but not the soft unraveling of a man reputed invulnerable, whose heart now beat differently in her presence. "You have given me something I thought lost forever," he continued. "Not love alone, but faith that a heart can open again without fear." Clara felt tears prick her eyes. "I only followed the truth I know," she said softly. "I could not live any other way." The Duke drew closer, the distance between them finally closing. She could feel the heat of his body, the steady rhythm of a pulse that had once seemed unyielding. "May I?" he whispered, his voice trembling with restrained longing. "You may," she breathed. His hands rose, brushing a strand of damp hair from her face. He paused, seeking her consent in the gentlest of ways. When she nodded, he leaned in slowly, deliberately, and their lips met. The kiss was tender yet charged, reverent rather than hurried, a culmination of weeks of longing, fear, and fragile trust. It was a promise, not possession, a declaration of hearts now intertwined. They lingered there, breath mingling, the scent of rain and roses surrounding them. For the first time, Clara felt the weight of society, scandal, and expectation lift. In the Duke's arms, she was seen, unjudged and cherished. And for the Duke, the cold fortress of his heart finally melted under the warmth of her presence. As they parted, both breathless, he rested his forehead against hers. "You said once that you had never been kissed," he murmured, voice low and tender. "I hope this was as you imagined." "It is beyond imagination," she whispered, her hand brushing the sleeve of his coat, feeling the steady strength of him. For a moment, they simply stood together, watching the dawn unfurl across Ashbourne Manor. The garden bloomed in defiance of the previous night's fire, petals glistening with hope. They had faced whispers, threats, fire, and scandal, and emerged not unscathed, but united. Then, from the distance, a horse's hoofs struck the gravel with deliberate urgency. A messenger arrived, breathless, bearing a letter sealed with the emblem of the crown. The Duke took it carefully, breaking the wax with hands that still trembled from both adrenaline and the aftertaste of their shared triumph. He read it, eyes narrowing, lips tightening. Clara felt the shift before he spoke. "The Crown requests our immediate presence," he said quietly, regarding the claims of Lord Whitmore. "It appears his machinations are not yet done." She gripped his arm instinctively. "Then we will face them together, as we always have." He looked down at her, the firelight of early morning catching in his eyes. For a fleeting heartbeat, the world fell away, leaving only the two of them standing against whatever storm might come next. And in that suspended moment, Clara realized that love, like courage, was a force that could weather any trial, but only if hearts remained steadfast, even when the path ahead promised further peril. The Duke folded the letter slowly, a shadow passing over his face. "Then it seems, Clara, our trials have only just begun." She nodded, and the manor seemed to exhale with them, petals trembling in the soft dawn, the promise of resilience and enduring love stretching toward the horizon.